So World War II ended in 1945. A gentleman by the name of Haim Slavin, the Jewish engineering genius, he was reading the local newspaper, and he happened upon an article about how 700,000 war surplus machines and tools of the U.S. armament industry in the next few months were to be converted into scrap metal because the war had ended. And he saw a great opportunity. If he could get those machines, and if he could smuggle them into Palestine, it could provide the beginning of the Jewish state's modern armament industry. Welcome to Israel Unveiled. My name is Sandy Wezowicz, and I'm so glad you could join me on this podcast today. You know, we're living in incredible days where Scripture literally is coming alive. This past week, I was drawn to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8 in particular. Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children. The prophet Isaiah in that chapter was speaking to a people who had just come back from 70 years in exile, where they had faced and lived through oppression and great hardship. The Babylonian exile had ended. And now there was renewed hope among those Jews who were returning back to the land, and it was in 538 BC. And they're now living in a day of promise, once again, of the restoration and the blessing of the land has come. However, it would be another 2,500 years in the 20th century that the fullness of that scripture would actually take place. The nation of Israel was indeed born in a day, just as that scripture said. On May 14th, in 1948, in a ceremony that lasted only 32 minutes, in the home of who would become the first mayor of Tel Aviv, Meir Dizengoff, it took only 32 minutes to declare a nation. But getting there took years in the making. You know, I read about some of the preparations of those years that took place that would lead up to the establishing of the State of Israel. And I learned so much about it when I purchased a book many years ago at a used book sale. I happened to pick up the book. I liked the title, so I just read a little bit about it and immediately knew this was a keeper. The name of the book was O Jerusalem, and it's a nonfiction book written by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, and it was published in 1971. In its 592 pages, it tells the incredible stories of both prominent Jews and of prominent Arab leaders in those years of 1947 and leading up to the State of Israel being established, and the battling that took place for all of Israel. And it also follows in great detail the lives of just common people in both communities, and as they were involved in the fierce struggle for the control of the city of Jerusalem. In history, I have to say, in that book, history really comes alive in those pages. It marked the end of the British rule over the region that had lasted for 25 years. So I just really briefly, I want to give you a little bit of background so you can kind of set the stage in your mind for the man that I want to highlight in this podcast. After World War I, a treaty had been signed in 1922, and it was ratified and signed by all of the nations in the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the precursor for the UN. Great Britain was, through that agreement, was to prepare what was left of the former Ottoman Empire. The land that was left after carving out other nations, the remaining was to be established as the State of Israel. 4 Arab nations had been carved out of that land: Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. However, for the next 27 years, the British did not honor that agreement to establish a Jewish state. In fact, they did just the opposite. Armed Arabs attacked Jewish settlements. By the way, those settlements were land that had been purchased legally and farmed, mostly purchased from absentee landowners that were living in Damascus, and by the way, selling to the Jews at incredibly inflated prices. And during that time, both pro-Arab and British authorities forbade Jews in Palestine from arming. So they allowed the Arabs to arm, but forbade the Jews. And so what happened is it made for the Jewish people great difficulty in procuring arms. They were organizing and they were training an underground army called the Haganah. It was a paramilitary army that would help protect the kibbutzim there against the attacks by the Arabs. Arabs, by the way, that were led by its leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who, by the way, was a personal friend of Adolf Hitler. Jewish leaders began preparing for not only to protect the settlements and the kibbutzim, but also they were preparing for what they knew eventually would come a new nation, and that they would have to defend it, because they recognized that once that nation of Israel would be established by the UN, announced by the UN, that they would face a well-trained Arab army coalition of 5 nations. And so the challenge then was to find a way to prepare and to be able to arm the underground army, the Haganah, since as I mentioned, the British had enforced a ban on weapons. So World War II ended in 1945, and shortly thereafter, a gentleman by the name of Haim Slavin, he was a Jewish engineering genius, was having coffee in a sidewalk cafe in Tel Aviv, and he was reading the local newspaper. And he happened upon an article, a small article, about how 700,000 war surplus machines and tools of the U.S. armament industry in the next few months were to be converted into scrap metal because the war had ended and there was no use for these machines. And he saw a great opportunity. If he could get those machines, and if he could smuggle them into Palestine, remember, pre-Israel was called Palestine, and if he could smuggle them into Palestine, it could provide the beginning of the Jewish state's modern armament industry. But the thing of it was, his time was limited. He had to work quickly before all of these machines would be disassembled and distributed in various places around the country. So he wrote David Ben-Gurion, who was one of the recognized leaders of the Jewish community, and he explained that there was an incredible opportunity to smuggle machinery into Palestine to provide the production of military arms. Well, David Ben-Gurion recognized the brilliance of this, so he was given permission to Haim Slavin to leave immediately for the United States. Now, as soon as he arrived, amazing by chance, at a newsstand in the U.S., he found stacks of back issues of Technical Machinery. That was the name of the periodical. And so he purchased all those back issues. And from photographs, he memorized, this is amazing, he memorized the technical details of all of the machines that would be needed. Then he went all over America, and he posed, by the way, as a deaf and mute person because he couldn't speak English well, and he didn't want to be recognized with any kind of a Jewish accent at all. And so he went around and he purchased as posing as a scrap metal dealer that he was buying machinery for manufacturing. And many of the machines whose sole parts were production of arms for the war effort were already broken down. So by law, by the way, and the parts were scattered, in various places around the country. So he assembled a team of scavengers to go to junkyards and buy the necessary parts. And he went from city to city. And what he did was he ordered that everything would be then sent to an abandoned warehouse in New York. He eventually would acquire the machinery to begin mass production of arms. Now, what do you do with them? But once you have these, well, to smuggle past the British, he first assembled all of the machines, then he disassembled them, and he numbered every single part. Now, there were 75,000 pieces. I mean, that's every nut and every bolt. And then what he did was he randomly scrambled them to be crated and sent to Palestine as 35 tons of machinery for a textile plant in the name of an imaginary Arab manufacturer. And when the machines were reassembled, this is amazing, and ready for operation, not one of the 75,000 pieces was lost. So then what happened to them? Well, they were sent and hidden in kibbutzim all over the country. There's a second part to this story, and that I learned after years of having read the book. I was on a tour with a group, and we were touring at different sites in Israel. And our particular tour guide included a visit to a place called the Ayalon Institute, which is 35 miles south of Tel Aviv. And he explained how this site was the scene of an important part of Israel's War of Independence. And as he told the story, I suddenly remembered Haim Slavin. Here was the second half of the story that was told in the book, O Jerusalem. The kibbutz that we were visiting, was one of the many that were involved in the production of armaments for Israel. So upon arriving in Palestine, I learned that Slavin's machinery to make bullets was safely hidden in an underground 25 by 100 foot factory that was built underneath a new kibbutz, hidden in plain sight from the nearby British Army base. And that's the very place that my group was visiting. It was amazing. By 1948, the factory was in full production. And how was this done? Well, they had 45 young kibbutzniks going to work underground. In the morning, they would quietly slip into a laundry room. And the one attendant in that laundry room would move the huge washing machine that was built on a movable platform. And here, then, once it was moved, they would quickly climb down and they would descend these hidden spiral steps and they would go underground. And they would not come up above ground until right before the rest of the people on the kibbutz who were working in the fields and in other places would be coming back. And so after the first few weeks, the leaders realized that they didn't have suntanned skin like all of those people who were working out in the fields. So they had to adapt. And they required each one of those 45 workers to spend a part of every day sitting right in front of the sun lamp to give them some color so that you couldn't distinguish them from those that were working in the field. And adjacent to the laundry was a bakery. And it was built to camouflage the smell of the machines working below ground. Their smokestacks were the air vents for the factory below. And to be sure that their heavy use of electricity wouldn't be noticed by the British, remember, there was a base, a British base, very close proximity, directly below them. So what they did was they tied in their electric lines right directly into the British power source. And to avoid any kind of surprise visit by the friendly British soldiers who like to come up to the kibbutz, what the kibbutz did was they said to the soldiers, because the soldiers loved the beer that was being produced in the kibbutz, so they said to the soldiers, look, we don't like to give you warm beer, so if you'll just give us a little notice, we'll put it on ice. And so when you come, just, let us know. By the time you come, it'll be nice and cold and you can enjoy your beer. The group working in this clandestine factory manufactured some 2.25, that's 2.25 million cartridges between 1945 and 1948. Once those cartridges as they were being manufactured, they were smuggled out in milk cans. And then they were transferred to fuel trucks. And that's no place to stash any kind of gunpowder-filled ammunition. But you see, they could then, once they were in those milk cans, they could be delivered any place around the country. The whole thing, this is amazing, remained a secret until 1973. And even the people working in the kibbutz never knew about it. They didn't learn a thing until it was publicly announced in 1973. Today, the Ayalon Institute provides a tour of the laundry, the underground factory, and the bakery. It's really an amazing tour, and it's an amazing achievement. That Haganah force, by the way, became today's IDF. I hope you've enjoyed this little piece of history. I love how one person in one place at one time can make such an incredible impact. If you'd like to see more podcasts like this, I hope that you will click like and share. And hopefully you'll sign up to my podcast on YouTube so that you can receive weekly podcasts that I put together. So blessings to you and shalom.